introducing what's going to happen next. And I guess I can do it with this background, that's fine. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Nicola Clayton. She's a professor of comparative cognition at the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. She's also a fellow of the Royal Society. Nikki is particularly interested in the processes of thinking without words and with words, and comparisons between the cognitive abilities of corvids, cephalopods, and children, so lots of the brilliant things you've been hearing about for the past hour. She's also interested in the role of cognitive constraints and embodied knowledge of movement and mental time travel. Nikki has a passion for dance, so it's been, I think, a really great week with the flamenco, and then there's been salsa, and we might hear more about dance later on. Nikki is also really excellent at integrating science and arts. For example, she's the science in residence and associate artist at Rambert, formerly Ballet Rambert. She has several multi-year collaborations, so over 16 years, with the award-winning choreographer Mark Baldwin. She has an equally long collaboration with artist and writer Clive Wilkins, who's also a magician and a member of the Magic Circle. And I think we're going to hear about maybe some of this work with Clive today. Nikki's won many awards, including the American Psychological Association Frank Beach Award, the Jean-Marie Delvort Award in Comparative and Evolutionary Neurosciences from the Belgian Royal Academy of Sciences. I have to take a deep breath here, there's so many to get through. The Experimental Psychology Mid-Career Award, and she was the first person to collect the ASAB, so the Association for the Study of Animal Behavior, Tinbergen Award, and ASAB Medal for Lifelong Achievements in Animal Behavior in the same year. And today we're honoring her with the Comparative Cognition Society Research Award. And one of the things I'm most grateful for what Nikki has done is her scientific outreach. We've heard a little bit about that already. So Nikki makes the type of work that we all do, everyone in this room, accessible and interesting for the general public. This is critical for the future of our field. Some of her outreach work includes being a writer for the BBC 2's Inside the Animal Minds, and a writer and a presenter for Radio 3's Between the Ears Year of the Corvid. So with that, I hope you all please join me in giving Professor Nicola Clayton, Fellow of the Royal Society, a warm welcome for her Master Lecture.
For that touching introduction, and thank you to the beautiful speeches in honour of my symposium by Mike, Estelle, Thomas and Jonathan. It was very moving, hence the shake in my voice, but a big thank you, and thank you for honouring me with this award. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be here today to share with you some adventures in comparative cognition, some of my adventures in comparative cognition. And I'll start by saying that I've always been fascinated by birds. I love the way they move, the way they fly, and that led me into a lifelong passion for dance. And I have invisible wings, which is why you can't see them, but they're very important to me. And I'm sure they help me when I'm doing my choreographic improv workshops with Mark Walden. I'm also fascinated by the way birds think, what lies behind that beady eye, and that led me to my research career studying comparative cognition. I suppose academically it really started in Oxford under the tutelage of John Krebs, where I studied the hiding behaviours of marsh tits. We now tend to call it caching, but at the time the popular word was hoarding. I guess hoarding means to gather up, but most of the hoarding birds actually hide the food, and that's why caching is a more accurate term. From there, I moved on to St Andrews, and I did my PhD looking at the decisions zebra finches make in choosing who to learn their songs from. And then I went back to Oxford as a junior research fellow and a university research fellow, again working with John Krebs. And I was there for a long time, and that's where I first really began working with the corvids, with jays and magpies and jackdaws, as well as continuing work on various tit species, great tits, blue tits, marsh tits and coal tits. And then I moved to the University of California, Davis, to take up an associate professor position, and that's where I fell in love with these guys. This is Psycho Bird, and in those days they were called Florida scrub jays, but they've changed their names a few times, and they're now called California scrub jays, but they're the same species. And in my experiments, although sometimes the Latin name changed, sometimes the local name changed, it was the very same birds, were just the same species, same individuals. And I was very lucky in being promoted rather quickly in the UC system. I went from assistant to associate with tenure in 2 years, and then to full professor in another 2 years. And then a year later, the wonderful Nick McIntosh lured me back home, but to the other one, to Cambridge. And that's where I then started working not just with the scrub jays, but also with corvids that occur in the UK, such as the rooks and the jays. But of course I didn't want to leave my beloved scrub jays behind, so when Nick McIntosh said, well, what things do we need to negotiate if you're going to accept a permanent position back at the University of Cambridge, I answered in a jiffy, 25 avian lectureships. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, well, it's Nicky and the Jays, or no Nicky. So needless to say, I brought my scrub jays with me. And as I then developed through my career and became more and more interested in the comparative nature of cognition, I also turned my attention to humans, especially children, because at least early on in life, they don't rely on verbal communication through language either. And then later on, as you've already heard from the wonderful presentations that Christelle and Mike have touched on, for example, on the cephalopods, such as the common cuttlefish here. So I want to start, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but I'm going to start with Psycho Bird and his fellow scrub jays. And the thing is that because I was trained as a zoologist and an ornithologist, but I've always been fascinated in psychology, but my degree was in zoology, I've always wanted to put an emphasis on natural behaviour and its ecological relevance. And so it seemed to me that caching was an interesting example if you wanted to study aspects of memory. Because what these birds do for a living is they hide food, and the only point of doing so is to get their caches back in the future. So it's a future-oriented behaviour. They also recover them and eat them at a later date, but they rely, as you heard in Anna's Roden's talk the other day, on memory. So they remember where they hid their caches. But do they remember other things about what they're doing when they're hiding caches? Can they, for example, keep track of what was cached, where and when, and even who was watching? And as you've heard from both John's talk and Christelle's talk, these are very interesting questions because at the time, people assumed that animals didn't have episodic memory, that they couldn't experientially remember the past, nor was there any need for them to do so. That was the assumption that animals, to use Bill Robertson's phrase, are stuck in time, that unlike humans, although I would argue humans are animals, but that's the zoologist in me talking, that it's only really humans that can travel back in the mind's eye to think about the past and forwards in the mind's eye to think about the future. And still to this day, I think the most eloquent expression of this idea comes not from a scientist, but from a poet, Robbie Burns, way back in the late 1700s. And in a poem called Ode to a Mouse, in the story he'd ploughed through a field mouse's nest, and he felt riddled with guilt, realising that as a result of this, he'd essentially killed the mouse because the mouse without a nest wouldn't be able to survive. And then he had a thought, and he turned to the mouse, and he said, "Still, thou art blessed compared with me. The present only touches thee, but oh, I backward cast my eye on prospects drear, and forwards, though I cannot see and feel." So for Robbie Burns, mice were stuck in time, and I suspect you would have thought that all other non-human animals were stuck in time as well. And ever since End of Tolkien made the distinction between episodic memory, which you've heard about in the earlier talks, the experiential memory of what happened where and when, as opposed to semantic memories about facts about the world that don't need to involve me or time. He endorsed Robbie Burns' quotes, and here's some little quotes from the wonderful late End of Tolkien. I miss him dearly, he was a very close friend. But he argued here that remembering past events is a universally familiar experience, but also a uniquely human one. Like members of the animal kingdom can learn, benefit from experience, acquire the ability to adjust and adapt, to solve problems and make decisions, but they cannot travel back into the past in their own minds. Later, Sundorf and Kubelis endorsed this with a mental time travel hypothesis, arguing that it constitutes a discontinuity between ourselves and other animals. Over a decade ago now, the late Michael Kubelis changed his mind, and until his death, he firmly believed that animals do have mental time travel. And I've tried my charms on Thomas Suttendorf. He's a bit more difficult, but we do have a paper which we have published together, claiming that New Caledonian crows are capable of future planning. So even he's not entirely changed camp, but is starting to think about it. And Tolkien added these other quotes. So that gives you a sense of what the mental time travel hypothesis was about originally. And of course, when I started to think about this, I was thinking, well, it doesn't make sense to me. Certainly in the case of these food caching jays, they're hiding perishable items. So surely if their favourite items, the waxworms and the Belgian truffles of the scrub jay world, the kind of equivalent to shrimps and cuttlefish, they're their favourite foods. Why wouldn't they want to keep track of how long ago in order to ensure they get them back whilst they're still fresh? But part of the problem was that the definition used in cognitive neuroscience was based on phenomenology and human phenomenology, which makes it rather tricky to know how to approach this in non-human animals. So, for example, a subjective feeling of re-experiencing a specific personal past event about what happened where and when. Well, it's not obvious to think how you could test that directly without asking how do you feel about your memory of what happened. An awareness that the event happened in the past, and a realisation that these are one's own memories. And together with Tony Dickinson, we were trying to come up with what we thought might be some key characteristics that could actually be tested behaviourally. And we stumbled on the following Gary Larson cartoon. All forest animals to this very day remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that Bambi's mother had been shot. Now, if Dr. Dolittle were fact, not fiction, and the snake could really say, I was under a rock getting ready to shed, I, for one, would be happy to say, I must have a sonic memory. But that triggered the idea that perhaps we could develop behavioural criteria for episodic memory based on this, namely, can an animal remember on the basis of a single past experience what happened, where and when. So that led us on to designing an experiment to attempt to test this. And caching is such a great behaviour for looking at these things because they naturally hide the food, and then there's naturally a delay, and then at some point in the future they come back and recover them. And so we had had two groups of birds, and because the birds had been hand-raised, I could be confident that they hadn't had any of these experiences because I hand-raised them from before they opened their eyes. So I knew that there was no way that they could have actually seen worms and peanuts and know about perishability rates. So the idea was that our degrade group, our experimental group, were essentially trained to learn that after a short delay, the worms are still fresh, and after a long delay, the worms have degraded. And jays love fresh worms, and they hate degraded worms. So we chose a short interval of 4 hours and a long interval of 124 hours. You might think, oh, 124, that's a bit random, isn't it? But it's just 5 days plus 4 hours, so that we're controlling for that it can't be circadian rhythms. And our replenished group, by contrast, they have the same retention intervals, get to hide the same food, peanuts and worms, but for them, worms are always fresh. And so there's no need to keep track of time in the same way. And here are the results of the training trials. And when I say training trials, the birds don't need to be trained to catch and recover. They do that naturally. All we're training them is about the perishability rates of worms and the fact that peanuts don't perish. And you can see that the degrade group recover worms and nuts at a short delay, but rapidly learn to stop searching for the worms at a long delay when they're inedible. And the replenished group, of course, continue with their searching strategies, because for them, worms and peanuts are always fresh. And then we do our test trials, where you have no food at the time of cache recovery to be sure that they're not using smell or other cues emanating directly from the caches. So you do the same thing, but now in the test trial there's no food present at the time of recovery. And you see that the replenished group, their first search is always towards worms, whereas the degrade group go for worms at the short delay and they go for the peanuts at the long delay. You get a similar result if you look at total number of searches as well. Now the issue here though is, and this is something that John touched on in his talk, is are the birds actually episodically remembering what happened where and when? Or could there be a simpler explanation in terms of relative familiarity? For example, I saw the trays a short time ago, or I saw the trays a long time ago. And Ruth Tolvin, Endel's wife, drew these beautiful cartoons of Endel talking to his pet cat, Kashu, and now she said, do you remember it, or do you just know it? And me talking to Sweetie Pie, one of the other scrub jays, a worm in the tray would say, do you remember it, or do you just know it? Now, because the trays that we got the birds to cache in, these are actually ice cube trays filled with sand, and we put these Lego Duplo bricks around the side so that it's easy for the birds to know that there are different trays, and they can therefore easily remember these visual spatial cues about the trays. But because there's two sides to each tray, you can actually block off one side of the tray so that you can only allow them to cache in either the left or the right hand side. And we use that to address this issue of relative familiarity. So we block off one side of the tray and allow the birds to cache either worms or peanuts. So, and obviously we control for the sides, so you can cache worms in the left or right and peanuts in the left or right. And of course, this is a test trial. They've not had any training and there's no food present. And then we let them cache in the other side, either peanuts if they cache worms first, or worms if they cache peanuts. And then they get another 4 hour delay. So the first delay of 120 hours is of course novel, but the point is by the time they get the caches back, they've seen the trays 4 hours ago, and they've also seen the trays 124 hours ago. And the idea is, well, the degrade group should, if they've remembered the sequence of caching events, rather than just going for, did I see it 4 hours or 124 hours ago, then they should search for peanuts in the top condition, and worms in the bottom condition. Now, if we only had the degrade group, we'd be in a bit of a pickle at this point, because a much simpler explanation is you just have to remember what you cached last. So this is where the replenish group is really important, because of course the replenish group should always go for the worms, irrespective of whether they were cached first or last. And they do, and you can see the results. Now, since then, many studies have looked at what were memories, or episodic-like memories, in a variety of different species. And big thanks to you, Chris and I, for giving me this slide many years ago. So big shout out to Chris. And these are some of the species that have been tested. And you see that the pigeons and the rhesus macaques fail, as do very young children. Children don't pass these tests until they're about 4 years of age. And since then, other people have said, well, maybe there are other ways we could get at this phenomenon, episodic-like memory. Perhaps we don't need the when. Could we use which? Could we use the context instead? That was suggested, for example, by Madeline Ecott and Alex Easton, and others, really led by Tom Zemple, who's sitting in the front row here. Thank you, Tom, for introducing this idea that Tom talked about earlier of incidental encoding and the unexpected question as being another way of getting at episodic-like memory, and a way that gets around the problem of, well, what if you've had multiple training trials? And we have looked at this kind of episodic-like memory using incidental encoding. So a couple of years ago now, Eli Garcia-Pellegrin and James Davies and others in our lab looked at dolphins and incidental encoding. Yes, they can do it. And most recently, we've looked at the jays, again work by James Davies and Eli Garcia-Pellegrin and myself, which is coming out in +1. And James and I have recently done a review in Phil Trans about the question of whether episodic-like memory really is like episodic memory. So what I want to do now is to move on to the other side of the coin. Because if these tests of episodic-like memory really are like episodic memory, and if this is part of the mental time travel system, then they should also be able to plan for the future. And what I'm going to show you very briefly is a little video. This is from BBC Two Inside the Animal Mind, where I was the writer and super contributor for a 3-episode series. But it shows these, this is my Portland Palace, the beautiful aviaries, and it shows kind of how we did the experiment.
But is this just another example of instinctive behaviour to survive the winter? Or is there something far more complex going on? It's a question that's greatly intrigued Professor Nicola Clayton. She studies western scrub jays, another American corvid, renowned for its caching behaviour. Nikki wanted to discover whether they could do more than just remember where they buried food in the past.
If they can travel back in their mind's eye to think about the past, can they also travel forward in the mind's eye to think about the future? Can they imagine the future, if you like? Can they plan ahead?
To find out, Nikki created an experiment based on a very human annoyance: waking up to find that breakfast is off the menu. For 6 days, the birds were housed in this aviary, split into 3 zones. In the middle is the dining room, where the birds were fed during the day, and at either end are the bedrooms, where they were kept at night. But there's a twist. Kept overnight in this bedroom, the birds were served an early breakfast. But kept overnight in this one, they got no breakfast and went hungry until mid-morning. The birds experienced this daily routine for almost a week.
So we give them 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the hungry room, and 3 lots of experiences of waking up in the room that serves breakfast. But But the important point is that the birds themselves didn't know which room they'd end up in on any given day.
But then, Nikki changed the test. She allowed the birds to cache food in the evening, before bedtime. She placed caching trays in both the hungry and breakfast rooms. The question was, where would they choose to store the food? Nikki wanted to know if the birds could use their past experience of the two different rooms and plan for the future, namely, for breakfast time tomorrow. The results left no doubt.
What we found is that the birds cache about 5 times as much in the hungry room as they cached in the breakfast room. They can imagine what they're going to need the following morning when they wake up hungry, so they can solve a problem before it's even happened. So what this experiment shows is that the birds can plan for the future.
So the jay's caching behaviour is far more than mere instinct. They have a grasp of the past, but can also anticipate future need and, crucially, plan for it. This skill is very rare in the animal kingdom, and it's the 4th key ability needed to solve problems.
It's about time travel, and I'll come back to the idea of this cognitive toolkit later in my talk. So here you can see the test trial, if you like. The key thing is that they've not had any opportunity to cache during training, during the time in which they learn that food is available in one room, the breakfast room, and food isn't available in the other. And then on the final test, they're given food that they can cache. So to prevent them caching the rest of the time, they're on powdered food. Now they're given a bowl of pine nuts, and the caching trays are placed in the 2 end compartments, and in the absence of knowing where they'll end up tomorrow when they go to bed, where should they cache them? If they could plan for the future, the idea is that they should put them in the no breakfast room, because if they wake up in the breakfast room, they'll get breakfast anyway. If they end up in the no breakfast room, if they've cached, they've brought their own breakfast. If they haven't cached, they'll go hungry. And you see, sure enough, that's exactly what they do. The vast majority are cached in the hungry room. So we did similar experiments with children, but we didn't use food, too worried about nut allergies. We used pine nuts or peanuts. Instead, we used toys. So rather than a breakfast room, we had a toy room, and rather than a no breakfast room, we had a no toy room. And we asked the children, they got 3 of these experiences in the toy room and 3 in the no toy room, just like the jays. And then we asked them, where would you like to put these? And of course, the correct answer is in the big bird's room, the no toy room, because if you put them in the no toy room, you'll have something to play with in the morning, otherwise you'll be really bored. And we told them, you're coming back tomorrow, where would you like to put them? We also did a control test, you're coming back right now, where would you like to put them? And if you ask them the control test, where would you like to put them, all children pass. So it's not that young children have a difficulty with understanding that it's best to put the toys in the no toy room. But if you do it for the future, if you do it for tomorrow, the 3-year-olds just put equal numbers in both rooms. It's only 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds that discriminate and choose the no toy room. We've also looked at other aspects of future-oriented decisions about foraging, planning like behaviours perhaps. So in this one we asked, could the jays learn what not to cache? So they get worms, their favourite food, and peanuts to cache. And 2 days later they get the caches back. The peanuts are fine, but those worms have degraded and now they're horrible and they spit them out. And then they get another trial 2 days after that, and another opportunity to cache the peanuts and the worms. And you see that over trials, the birds rapidly learn to stop caching the worms that are yummy to eat right now, but disgusting to eat at the time of recovery, and instead compensate by increasing the number of peanuts. We've also looked at whether we could test the Bischoff-Kohler hypothesis, which is essentially this idea of can you ignore your current desires in order to choose the option for the future. And so here we capitalise on the notion of specific satiety. So you're given one food, you eat it till you're sated, then you're given the choice of that food and another food, and you always go for the other food. I call it the dessert principle effect with respect to people. You've just had that large enchilada or Caesar salad. You've left some of it because the portions are massive here. If somebody says, do you want another one, you're like, I've still got some of that left, I'm completely full. And then the dessert trolley comes along, and having left some of the food and claimed you're completely full, you somehow manage that cheesecake or ice cream or whatever. Dessert principle effect. But basically it's the idea that if you've eaten to satiety on one food, if you're given the choice of that food, the pre-fed food, and a non-pre-fed food, a new food, you'll eat some of the new food, but you won't be interested in the pre-fed food. So the idea is that the birds get the opportunity to catch two kinds of food, equally preferred foods, so I've just called them A and B, but it might be things like peanuts versus soap versus cat biscuits. And what you do is you pre-feed them just before catching and just before recovery. And the idea is if you pre-fed them A just before catching, they're going to want to eat and catch B. And we call this the same group because they're pre-fed the same food before catching and before recovery. And of course we control, so there's another group that's pre-fed B before each of those, but for simplicity I'm just showing one of the conditions. The other condition is that you're pre-fed one food prior to catching and then the other food prior to recovery. So in this example here it's A versus A and then B, but of course we also tested birds with B and then A. And here of course, if the birds are caching for what they want right now, then the different group should do the same as the same group. They should continue eating and caching the non-pre-fed food time. But the problem with doing that is that when they come back to recover the food, it's A they're going to want to eat, not B. Having been pre-fed B, they don't want any more B. So if they can think about what they will need in the future at the time of recovery, as opposed to the time of catching, then although they should continue eating the non-pre-fed food type, they should actually switch to caching the pre-fed food type A, the one they don't want now, because although they don't want it now, it is what they will want in the future. So this just shows that the specific satiety works. The birds in both groups much prefer the non-pre-fed food over the pre-fed food, but obviously the critical results of what they do with respect to caching. And you see here that indeed the different groups switch to caching the pre-fed food, the food they don't want now, but they will want in the future. So that's some of the ways in which we try to address future planning in the jays. We've also shown that in Eurasian jays they can do it too, and in this case we decided to do a within species control, so rather than having the same group and a different group, everybody gets the same tray and a different tray, and you can see the birds do that too. And then we asked whether the cuttlefish might optimise foraging using episodic light memory. And we know from Christelle's talk that they do indeed do this. So essentially, cuttlefish eat fewer crabs for lunch if shrimp are on the menu for dinner. I'm not going to go through the details because Christelle's already told you about that and more eloquently than I could possibly explain. And of course, we call it future-oriented and not future planning because we don't know, we haven't controlled the motivational state, but we are about to, this summer, start some experiments on future planning in octopus, led by my postdoc Alex Schnell, but together with, in collaboration with Christelle and with Eli. So watch the space to see if octopus can run in the future. Okay, well, some of this work has important implications. all the work that Christelle's done and a lot of the work that Christelle and I have done together in our wonderful collaboration over all these years. And one of the things that's happened is that thankfully cephalopods are now recognised as sentient under UK law as a result of this work. It's not just cephalopods, it's also decapods, but obviously my work's on the cephalopods. But it also raises interesting questions about the evolution of cognition. So, the coleod cephalopods, and in our case focusing largely on the cuttlefish, suggest that they're capable of future-oriented decision-making. They can pass the marshmallow test, and they do these what we're well known as, and all the other evidence that Christelle touched on in her talk and more, because we've done a lot more than she could cover in 15 minutes. But it's interesting because it seems to suggest that they have complex cognition, or they're passing tests that the corvids and the great apes are passing, and yet it doesn't feel like it should be thought of as convergent evolution, convergent minds, because the selection pressures are different. We've argued that in corvids and great apes, there are both the social pressures that Thomas touched on and described in detail about the social intelligence hypothesis, and told you some of his beautiful experiments on the ravens. And we know that there are also ecological pressures, keeping track of degrading and ripening food types, for example, and using tools to acquire foods that you couldn't otherwise get. But those things don't seem to apply to the cephalopods. Certainly, if they have social pressures, they're weak at least. They don't live a long time. They don't form complex alliances. They don't show evidence of competition and cooperation in the way that's standardly tested in the corvids and great apes and other primates that Clayton talked about in his talk. It's more that it seems to be to do with loss of shell, maybe leading to high predation and dynamic camouflage, and what Christelle touched on, this whole idea that when they are foraging, it's rapid bouts of foraging that is so important over their short but dynamic lifestyle. So why do we think that there is good evidence of convergence in the corvids and the great apes? Well, here is this toolkit of things that we talked about. And I've already covered prospection, imagination and flexibility within the realm of mental time travel. But what about causal reasoning? Well, when we started physical problem-solving tasks with the corvids, we assumed that they don't use tools because rooks and jays don't use tools in the wild. New Caledonian crows do, and Hawaiian crows, but not jays and rooks. And so we were rather surprised when we noticed that they were spontaneously using tools when they needed them in problem-solving tasks. I guess they don't need them in the wild because of the kinds of foods they eat. Rooks have very long bills, and they use them for digging. I'm not sure a tool or a stone would really be terribly helpful. And the same for the jays with the foods that they eat. Their beak is strong enough to open an acorn. They don't need nutcracker tools like we do. So we decided some of the work, I'm just going to focus on one kind of task here. It's called the Aesop's Fable task. It's based on the crow in the picture. And the idea is that you present the bird with a tube of water, but the water level is too low for the bird to acquire the reward. Now, in the original crow on the picture, of course, the bird is thirsty and got stones in the picture to raise the water level to drink. In our case, we motivate them with these waxworms. And here you can see Romero using the stones to get his reward, his waxworms. So we use this very simple task to ask questions about what the jays might understand about the task. The example I'm going to give you is one in which they're given two kinds of objects. Some are heavy and they sink, and therefore they raise the water level, and some are light and float, and therefore they don't. So here you can see in the BBC One in action of our experiment. That's why it all looks so clean. We've got marbles and pieces of cork, and this is Romero's first. This was based on Romero's first trial. Picks up a heavy one. Has a good look. Tries a different one. Has a good look. Decides to go for the stones. Has another good look. Removes the offending. Doesn't want to block the tube. So there you see. And it's something we can do for children as well. That's just the results of the two beds that we were able to test on. With the children, what we do, it's no good giving them worms, but we give them a sticker, a very tiny sticker that floats, but that sticker can then be exchanged for a big sticker that says, University of Cambridge, I'm as clever as Clayton. They love those stickers. A 4-year-old little finger is the same length as a Eurasian jade fin. And then here you see the sinking and floating version. We tested 4 to 10-year-old children. This is a 6-year-old child. And I think you can see he's not quite got the details down yet. Bless his cotton socks. And he's not very happy either. This is a 9-year-old child. She's got a little bit more about her. And here you see the results. So 4 and 5-year-olds are at chance, 6 and 7-year-olds are better, but not significantly above chance. It's not until they're 8 that they're able to spontaneously solve the test. So the one thing I haven't really talked about yet, I've talked about mental time travel and I've talked about causal reasoning, but they're all physical problems in a sense. But what about the social lives of corvids? Well, again, I'm going to go back to caching because it's such a useful behaviour for investigating some of these things. And we argued that cache protection tactics evolved with the future in mind. And this experiment was actually inspired by observations in the wild that Thomas talked about. So what I used to do at UC Davis, I'm a movement junkie, I'm a fidget monster. You don't want to sit next to me on an aeroplane, I'm an absolute complete nightmare. So I like to walk, and during the lunch breaks, I would just walk throughout campus. Davis has a lovely little campus, very pretty, and it's filled with scrub jets, they're everywhere. And they're very cheeky, and I would watch them steal faculty members and students' lunches. You know, to get distracted, there'd be some potato chips on the side, and the next thing they know, they vanished. And you could see who the thief was, who, you know, it was a scrub jet. But what I noticed, when they were hiding food, very often, when other birds were around, they would hide it very quickly, but then they'd recover it just seconds later, or minutes later in some cases. And I thought, what the heck's going on? They're supposed to be long-term caches. They're supposed to cache over hours, if not days and months. Why are they now doing it in the form of seconds and minutes? And I noticed they only seem to do it when other birds were present, not if they were on their own. And so that led Nathan and I to devise an experiment in which we could test this idea. Is the idea that they're coming back and moving the cache to a new place actually a cache protection tactic, a way of maximising the chance that they will get the cache back later and minimising the chance that a potential pilferer, a thief, could steal, and we use the word pilfering so as not to infer any ownership about it. But for simplicity here, if I refer to thief, you know I don't really mean thievery in the way it would be used in law. So the idea is that they cache in one tray whilst they're observed, or they cache in private. Then the caches are removed, the trays containing the caches are removed, and then 3 hours later they get their old tray back, the one they cached in, the observed tray, if they've been observed, and then private tray, if they cache in private, and a new tray. And the question is, do the birds move their caches to the new tray? And if so, do they only do it when they're observed, not in private? And the answer is experienced thieves, in other words, birds who have had extensive experience of pilfering other birds' caches. The answer is yes, they move them to new places, but really only if they've been observed. And in fact, we now know only if they've been observed by a potential threat. If they've been observed by their mate, we don't bother to recache. But naive birds, birds who hadn't had the opportunity to steal other birds' caches, don't do it. And we can make these qualifications because the birds have been hand raised, and therefore we know who has and who hasn't had the opportunity to pilfer other birds' caches. So we argued that this is a form of social cognition. In short, it takes a thief to go a thief. You use your own past experience of stealing another bird's caches and predict the observer's potential pilfering, reasoning by analogy with your own experience. Now, when I was doing these experiments, I started to get interested in magic because I thought actually a lot of the cache protection tactics that the birds do seem rather similar to those that magicians do. And because my casual partner, Clive Wilkins, is a magician, a professional magician, a member of the Magic Circle, and sometimes we would do double acts together, I got to know a lot of the magic tricks. And it seemed to me, these ideas could be rather similar to what magicians are doing. Now the problem with that is that Clive, although he's a brilliant magician, doesn't have any experience with food caching corvids. And although I have a fair amount of experience with food caching corvids, I'm not a magician. I don't have the predisposition skills to do those kinds of magic effects. So I had to wait until I got this most wonderful PhD student come along. And yes, his name is Elias Garcia Pellegrin. And that's when we could really start doing these effects, because it turns out that Eli is an excellent magician as well. And this could come in very handy. And we started by writing a paper in Science where we just speculated that perhaps experiments with magic effects might be informative about the cognition of animals. And these corvids in particular, because cache protection is what we do for a living, and that what magic effects capitalise on is revealing blind spots and seeing robots and thinking. And in thinking about some of the ones, like using shade and barriers and keeping track of who's watching and listening when and how to distract, it's certainly true that when I'm watching the jays, I was immediately thinking, gosh, they're behaving really like Clive. I wonder if there's something we could do with this. And here's one example. So when the birds move caches in private, we have little GoPro cameras on the top of the cage. You can see what's going on. They don't know we can see it because we're not in the room. But it's easy to see the items are moved once and the worms are fully visible. But when they're recached when others observed, they use what I think of as sight of beat. You can't see what's in the bin and whether it's really been moved to where you think it has. And typically they're moved about 6 times. And it may be in the original location, it may be in the final location, or it may be in locations 2, 3, 4, or 5. So I think of it as sight of beat, and also they have secret pockets. That bird there had about 4 worms hidden into the throat pouch. So we thought that it might be rather interesting to then actually do some magic effects on the birds rather than just make parallels between what the birds naturally do and what magicians do, to actually test these things. So what I want to do briefly now is show you a little film that the new scientists kind of know about some of the magic effects that we've conducted on the jays, because I think it's better for you to actually see it in action and see how the birds respond and how Eli performs the effects.
Magic tricks are a fascinating window on our minds.
Indeed. Do I have anything behind my ear? I doubt it. Anything in my hand? Of course not. It means that this should be physically impossible.
They highlight gaps in our
That's
perception
right.
and attention, which magicians exploit to disguise what's in front of our eyes.
I suppose according to the yes.
But what about other animals? Do they fall for the same tricks we do?
That's Eli's hand. There he is.
So I like flaws in their perception. Or could an ability to be misled actually reveal kinds of intelligence we didn't know they had?
How did you become interested in doing magic tricks?
Well, I've always wanted to be a bird. I've always wanted to fly and move around three-dimensionally and think like a bird. So that's how I got into science. But also through my passion for dance, I met Professor
That's Argentine tango.
who's artist in residence in the Department of Psychology. And he's a professional magician. And we both shared a great interest in memory and mental time travel through different perspectives, art and science.
I visited Cambridge University's Comparative Cognition lab to see how the group were examining the mental abilities of jays using magic tricks.
Jays are extremely intelligent. We call them the feathered apes because they're on a cognitive path with the chimpanzees. And they're also very attentive. They really watch what you're doing. And so they became the perfect subject.
Elias Garcia Pellegrini spent months working with the birds in order to prepare for the experiments.
So one of the things that Eli was able to do was to train them to peck a thumb to ask them which hand they thought concealed the object he'd hidden.
This trick is known as a French drop.
Good job, baby.
Jays don't fall for it, but perhaps that's not surprising. When humans watch the trick, we assume that the left hand is grasping the worm.
Your brain uses shortcuts when you perceive this movement. It just goes, well, what's the most likely thing to happen? Well, the most likely thing to happen is that when this hand grabs an object, the most likely thing is for a completed transfer to occur. And that's where magicians are very good. Because they are very good at seeing how to make a movement which is perceptive so unlike a real movement that the brain does not notice it. Even though there are particular kinematics that would tell you that this movement is fake, right? Like the tension. But you don't see that because you're just using the shortcuts in perception. However, birds don't need these expectations to survive because they do not have hands.
But the birds do fall for some other tricks.
Okay. Have a look. Where is it? Here. Your own?
On my visit, it wasn't just the birds being treated to a show.
Sam, do you remember the £10 note we talked about? Can I borrow it now? Excellent. Thank you very much. What's there?
When I watch this trick, I'm pleasantly surprised by the increase in my fortunes. A similar trick was used to make the jays think their favourite snack had been replaced with a different one.
Basically, what we did is that we chose the waxworm in this case. We pretended to deposit it inside the cup, and then we turned the cups around. Then Stuka went in and chose to retrieve the cup where she saw the waxworm. But in doing so, she found that magically the waxworm had transformed into a mealworm. And then we measured how long it took Stuka, or any of the rats that we tested, to actually ingest, to eat the worm. Okay? And we found that when we did this case, at the value condition, so their first preferred item magically transformed into their less preferred item, they took way longer than when we did an up-value condition. So their less preferred item, in this case, transformed into their most preferred. Think about the magic effect that Clyde did for you. Okay? You were happy because a £10 note became a £20 note, That's great, right? But what if Clive takes your 10-pound note and transforms it into a 5-pound note? It's not that happy anymore, right? You're not that willing to take that 5-pound note anymore. You want to give it back. You want Clive to transform it into a 10-pound note again. That's what happens.
Are you doing any magic experiments with any other animals besides squirrels?
We're hoping to do some magic effects with primates. And we're also excited about exploring some of these ideas with cephalopods, cuttlefish, octopus.
So here you can see Eli in action. Stuka readily learns to peck his thumb in order to choose which hand it's in. And I have to say that the jays learn these things very, very quickly. I think it took Eli a lot longer to perfect French drop using worms. It's easy, relatively speaking, to do it with a coin, but with a wiggly worm, it's a lot more challenging. And I think that his wife, Katie, was a miracle worker and so tolerant, because in the beginning, I think a number of those worms wiggled across the kitchen floor to freedom. So he performed 3 kinds of tasks. You saw them in the video: palm transfer, French drop, and fast pass. And here you can see the photos of the palm with the French drop and the fast pass technique. And here are the results. So percentage of correct responses. So high responses means they guess correctly. Low responses mean they're fooled. So they're not fooled by palm transfers and French drops, but they are fooled by fast pass. Now we know that in normal situations, when a magician performs in front of an audience, people are fooled by all of these effects. But of course, to make it a proper experiment, we needed to perform it with people too, and to make sure that people got the same viewpoint as the jays. So I'll just show you a tiny little video that Eli made of this. So you're first going to see what it looks like for a Eurasian jay. This is from their perspective. And now this is what the people were shown. So this is just to tell them to get ready to concentrate. There you go. And what we see is they're also fooled by all 3. So doing it in the cage doesn't make it easier, funnily enough. So then what we did was we thought, well, it's fascinating that the birds are fooled by one effect, but not by the other. Is it something to do with hands? Because there are ways in which hands can work like a wing, but French drop, for example, requires fingers and thumbs, and particularly having an opposable thumb. So we thought it would be really interesting to test different species of monkeys, because they all have hands, but marmosets have hands that work more like a wing, whereas the squirrel monkeys and capuchins have opposable thumbs. Capuchin opposable thumbs are really good, and they use them a lot in their foraging. They're proper opposable thumbs. Squirrel monkeys have a sort of opposable thumb. It can gotta do that, but it can't grip. So here you see the sleight of hand trick, the French drop. Wrong. power lines as this from this section. And here you see the results. So with the precision grip that depends on opposable thumbs, marmosets are not fooled. They behave like the jays. The squirrel monkeys and capuchins are fooled. But if we reenact the grip using the power one, so that you don't need an opposable thumb, the marmosets are also fooled. So that's the end of my master lecture in terms of research. But before I finish completely, I'd just like to do some acknowledgements, some thank yous. So first of all, thank you to all of you for supporting me here and coming and listening to my talk, and to CO3 for inviting me and the brilliant help and organisation. And of course, a big thanks to all my lab artists in residence, my Wilkins, and my current lab and former labs, some of whom are pictured here. And of course, my avian lab, my birds, without my wonderful researchers and wonderful birds, none of this would be possible. And thanks to the fundings that have supported me over the years. But there's one other acknowledgement. Oh, what's happened? Thank you. There's one other acknowledgement I'd like to give. And many of you know that my Corvid Palace was in jeopardy. And one of my PhD students sat at the front here, Francesca Conero, and I really fought very hard to try to prevent the university from closing down our facility. And thanks to all of you that signed the petition that made the university actually listen to us, and because before that it was falling on deaf ears. And thanks to all of you who supported me emotionally and financially, and a big thank you to the general public who also supported. We got lots of little gifts, and many people donated money, some tiny, some huge. But the result is we've raised £750,000, and the Corvid Palace is now safe for the next few years. And I thought this painting, it's work done by Pere Chen, who is a researcher in our lab, but as you can see from the painting, she's also an amazing artist. I thought the notion of the three-legged crow that's common in Southeast Asian culture is appropriate here. In Japan, the three legs stand for past, present, and future. So it's a lovely representation of mental time travel. But the Chinese poem in the background tells a slightly different version of the story. It's still about the cleverness and wisdom of crows. But in the Chinese version of the story, crows are the only non-human animals that aren't scared of humans or fires. And so they go into the areas where the humans have their lit fires and use the smoke from the fires to fumigate their wounds. And then at dawn, as the sun rises, they fly off and become the golden light lit by the sunrise. And it's a metaphor for hope and positive feelings for the future. And thanks to all of you who supported me, all in the audience, all our other friends and colleagues, all the general public that supported us, we now have hope that we can continue our work with these amazing, brilliant Corvids. With that, I will finish. Thank you.
And that concludes our master lecture. I hope everyone has a lovely evening. Thank you.